Welcome back, everyone. This is my first reaction that I'm recording after getting back from Scotland. My kids and I had an amazing time there. It was cold up in Orkney, but saw a lot of really cool history. Did leave behind my laptop, so it has not yet been found, or at least the train that we took coming back from Inverness to London has not gotten back to me saying they found my laptop, but I left it in my room on the train, so hopefully it turns up. Didn't lose anything permanently. I still have all my raw files from the videos that I've recorded different places. Just lost some editing work that I had done on some upcoming videos. So while I was in the UK, you may have heard that we had a presidential debate that generated a little bit of news. And that, of course, led WatchMojo to do a video right away called Top 20 Embarrassing U.S. Presidential Moments. So that's what we're going to dive in today. We'll talk a little bit more about the history behind these people and these events. And I'll put the link down in the description so you can check it out without my commentary. I'm guessing most of you are pretty familiar with WatchMojo by now. So it's good to be back. Getting back to regular content. New gaming video will be going up today as well. So if you want to check out VTH Gaming, links to all of my other channels are in the description of every video. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
An unraveling of a presidency begins here?
It begins right in this space.
Welcome to WatchMojo, and today we're counting down our picks for the most questionable decisions and politically fraught moments that left permanent smears on the legacies of U.S. presidents.
So I just want to say this up front before we even dive into this, because I've been thinking about this topic as I prepared to record this video. You know, we all, whatever segment of the workforce that we are a part of, whatever we do for a living, whatever our role is in our family, we all have moments that we're pretty embarrassed about. We all have things that we wish we hadn't done. We've made bad choices. Hopefully, in most of our cases, those things did not play out for a wide audience. In the case of people who choose to run for the highest office in the United States, everything's out there for the world to see, and so that means your great successes and your great failures, it's out there for everybody, and that's part of what you accept when you decide to run. It doesn't keep me from feeling pretty bad for these guys in some of these cases. Then again, some of it's pretty self-inflicted.
120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans within 4 months were put into barracks. I mean, how does that happen?
Number 20, George W. Bush Missionaccompl
remember that one.
speech. In May 2003, 6 weeks after invading Iraq, President George W. Bush gave a speech in front of a Mission Accomplished banner, declaring the end of major combat operations in the country.
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
However, the conflict was far from over. In many ways, it had only just begun. The war went on for another 8 years, with the majority of deaths occurring after this speech. When the criticism began pouring in, the Bush administration claimed the banner was requested by the Navy. They then stated that Mission Accomplished only referred to the initial invasion, not the war.
So a couple of things about this, some background. So George W. Bush actually lands on this aircraft carrier in a fighter plane. Like, they fly him in. It's all political theater. They fly him in on a fighter jet, and he had been a fighter jet pilot back in his reserve days in the military during the Vietnam War when he served stateside in the, I think, the Air Force Reserve. So it's easy now in hindsight to look back with a great deal of scorn and criticism over the entire debacle around Iraq. Of course, the justification was that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. Turned out not to be the case, or at least we didn't find any great quantities of this stuff. There's some evidence maybe it was there and it got destroyed or gotten rid of. But regardless, you have to understand that at the time in 2003 when this all went down, and I was in Washington, D.C. when this war began. I had a previously planned research trip to the National Archives, so I was there when this all went down. But at the time, everybody was on board with it. Even like the likes of Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton, who were in the Senate at the time, voted for the authorization of the use of force. Everybody saw the same intelligence information, which turned out to be wrong, horribly wrong. But everybody at the time made the same decision. Now, you can still criticize Bush for other motivations, other reasons why he would want to go after Saddam Hussein. But at the time, it was a fairly popular decision to make. That said, this whole thing in hindsight, bad optics. The mission accomplished whatever it was really meant to be. How it came across, especially in light of what came after, and how Iraq really bogged down into kind of a mini Vietnam. Not a good look. Definitely an embarrassing moment for Bush, though I would say Katrina probably is worse for him.
This incident echoed earlier misinformation by the Bush administration regarding Iraq's alleged possession of weapons of mass destruction, despite hardly any intelligence supporting such claims.
What justifies everything is the removal of a threat. I mean, Saddam Hussein, weapons or no weapons, which would have been a threat had he remained in power.
Number 19, George Washington, the Whiskey Rebellion. In 1791, just 2 years into his presidency, George Washington's administration enacted what became known as the whiskey tax.
Not anticipating the hostilities to follow, Congress passed the excise whiskey tax of 1791. Its ripple effects would be far-reaching and incite violent division.
Proposed by Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, its aim was to generate revenue to tackle the national debt incurred during the Revolutionary War. This tax faced staunch opposition from small farmers who deemed it unfair since they had to distill their grain into whiskey for easier transport and sale. The backlash quickly turned violent, with farmers refusing to pay and even attacking tax collectors.
Pennsylvania farmers lashed out against collectors, tarring and feathering them in certain instances.
In response, Washington personally led an army to quash the protests.
Along with
But
Hamilton.
the rebels all fled, and no conflict ensued.
So you have to remember this time. Well, let this play through the
While
rest of the way.
Washington managed to suppress resistance to federal laws, the tax failed to achieve its goal and was repealed in 1802. Number 8.
So a couple things about this. Number one, there's no federal income tax at this point. So the primary means for the federal government to get revenue comes in the form of tariffs. It's taxes on imports. But the government's looking for other ways to be able to collect revenue, and this kind of a sin tax is what it was. It was a tax on whiskey. Well, it proportionally hurt certain segments of the population more than others, because obviously people who weren't involved in the sale of whiskey or the creation of whiskey weren't hit by this tax, and so it was seen as unfair by the people who were hit by this tax, in particular in southwest Pennsylvania, the area around Pittsburgh. This is where this whiskey rebellion takes place, and Hamilton and Washington ride out at the head of an army to go put this thing down. Thankfully, it doesn't come to a civil war, but think about it. This is a country that had just come through fighting a revolution to break free from the British government, as they argued it over what they saw as unfair taxes. Now, what's the difference here, of course, is that this isn't taxation without representation. These people are represented in the government. So you could argue it's not the same thing. But I don't know how embarrassing it was for Washington. And certainly I don't think I'd put it in my top 20 embarrassing presidential moments. Because by and large, Washington has a pretty good administration without a lot of this. So I don't think it goes in my top 20.
18. Grover Cleveland sex scandal. During the presidential elections of 1884, Democratic candidate Grover Cleveland was seen as a formidable option, earning voter support for his anti-corruption stance.
Grover Cleveland, known as Grover the Good to his supporters, easily won his party's nomination for president in July of 1884.
However, in the lead up to the election, allegations surfaced that Cleveland had fathered an illegitimate child with a widow named Maria Halpin. Halpin claimed that Cleveland sexually assaulted her, then had her committed to an insane asylum, and put their child up for adoption. When the scandal became public, Cleveland admitted to paying Halpin child support.
This time, his staff didn't even bother to deny that he and Halpin had previously been what they described as
illicitly acquainted.
His opponents seized upon the controversy, creating the chant, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" which dogged Cleveland's campaign. Despite the shocking sex scandal, Cleveland's supporters remained loyal, helping him secure a narrow victory at the polls. Number 7.
And then he goes on to end up marrying a girl who had basically been his foster daughter. She was the daughter of his business partner, and he ends up marrying her when she turns 21. And it's a crazy time. But yeah, he acknowledges it. He owns up to it. He denies that there was any sexual assault involved with all of this. And I think there probably wasn't if you look at all the information, but it's one of those he said, she said things. It's impossible to know for sure. But that was really less a embarrassing presidential moment and more a embarrassing presidential candidate moment. I mean, he eventually becomes president, but I guess I'm splitting hairs.
17. George H.W.
Remember
Bush,
this one.
no new taxes. By now, voters have grown accustomed to politicians failing to fulfill their campaign promises. But when a candidate centers their campaign around a key issue, they should probably expect to be held accountable.
My opponent now says he'll raise them as a last resort or a third resort. But when a politician talks like that, you know that's one resort he'll be checking into.
That was precisely the case with President George H.W. Bush. Throughout his 1988 campaign, Bush consistently pledged not to introduce any new taxes if elected. He emphasized this commitment at the Republican National Convention, stating,
"Read my lips. No new taxes."
Well, guess what? There were, in fact, several new taxes. Bush's backtrack on this promise lost him the support of many within his party and became a focal point of the 1992 election, where Bill Clinton successfully portrayed him as untrustworthy. This ultimately contributed to his re-election defeat. Number 6.
Now, I will say this about this. It was definitely a big deal at the time. Even somebody like myself who was a teenager at the time, I remember this super well. It's probably more Ross Perot being in the election that costs George H.W. Bush his re-election than anything. Bill Clinton was kind of an underdog that whole campaign. He was an underdog for the primary, eventually wins. One of the youngest people ever elected president. But George H.W. Bush becoming president in the first place was a pretty rare occurrence when you think about it. He had been vice president for 8 years, and then he gets elected president. It's the only time in my lifetime that we have had 8 years of one president, and then the following president who gets elected is from the same party. That has not happened in any other point in our lifetime. Look at our two-term presidents. Reagan, followed by Bush, same party. Then you get Clinton for 8 years, but then you go to George W. Bush for 8 years, and then you switch back to Obama for 8 years. So it doesn't happen very often. It's also the only president in my lifetime, other than Jimmy Carter, who was president when I was born, who hasn't been reelected when he ran for a second term. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. But yeah, the no new taxes thing was harped on like crazy. Bush was dealing with a Democratic Congress, and he kind of got into a situation where he's trying to negotiate some things with this Democratic Congress to get stuff done, and he ends up acquiescing to some new taxes in direct violation of that pledge that he made.
16. Thomas Jefferson, the Embargo Act. During the Napoleonic Wars, America sought to remain neutral, resisting pressure from Britain and France to join the conflict.
Another European war threatened to spill across the Atlantic as France and Britain once again battled it out.
When the British began forcing U.S. sailors to join their navy, President Thomas Jefferson decided to sign the Embargo Act of 1807, which halted all American exports abroad.
And so a lot of times when we talk about the British taking American sailors and putting them into their navy, it's called impressment. We talk about that in terms of a catalyst for the War of 1812. But this was already going on during Jefferson's administration. It just continues to build up, and this Embargo Act doesn't really de-escalate, but rather escalates the situation to where you're going to have Madison as president when we get into war.
Jefferson hoped this would pressure Britain and France to respect American neutrality. Instead, this strategy backfired, as the act negatively affected the U.S. economy, leading to widespread smuggling and protests, especially in the New England region.
All the embargo manages to do is to cause an economic depression.
This was particularly damaging for America, which was a relatively new nation at the time. Faced with growing opposition, Jefferson quietly repealed the act in the last days of his presidency. Number 15. Woodrow Wilson, the Espionage Act and Sedition Act. America's entry into World War I in April 1917, after nearly 3 years of neutrality, was met with significant domestic dissent. To suppress this opposition...
Yeah, Wilson ran in the 1916 election on the slogan of, "He kept us out of war." And then he gets inaugurated for his second term in March. And then a couple weeks later, we're at war with Germany.
President Woodrow Wilson signed two laws, the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918.
The most memorable provisions of the Espionage Act regulated anti-war speech and made it a federal offense to say or do or publish things that would interfere with the war effort.
The Espionage Act originally aims to crack down on actual espionage by penalizing interference in foreign policy and military operations. However, the Sedition Act greatly expanded its scope, prohibiting disloyal speech against the U.S. government.
I want to go back to that video for a second, because
prohibiting disloyal speech against...
I was trying to figure out who that was next to Pershing. I thought for a second it was Charles Whittlesey, but I don't think it is.
The U.S. government, which seems to violate the Constitution's free speech protections. These acts resulted in widespread prosecutions targeting socialists and pacifists, including notable figures like Eugene V. Debs.
It's interesting that sometimes you'll hear folks on the political right argue that Woodrow Wilson was a socialist, but he actually targeted socialists with this law.
Eugene V. Debs was arrested. He was tried under the Espionage and Sedition Acts. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison.
The Sedition Act was ultimately repealed in 1920, but the Espionage Act remains in effect today.
So, and I'm sure we're going to get to John Adams with here it is right here, the Alien and Sedition Acts, which a few of those things are still, I think, technically on the books. To me, of course, I don't know why we're looking at a picture of Thomas Jefferson. It looks like Thomas Jefferson, certainly not John Adams there. But I can't believe I'm going to do this, but at the risk of sounding like I'm defending Woodrow Wilson, which I'm not, those acts were absolutely wrong. They were perfectly in line, though, with what other wartime governments were doing in Europe at this time. It was nothing different that was going on with the U.S. government in terms of how they were trying to crack down on espionage and on dissent that the British and the French and the Germans and the Italians and the Austro-Hungarians and the Russians weren't doing as well. Doesn't make it right, but I'm sure that he saw it that way, that, hey, they're doing this too. What's the big deal? We got to do what's necessary in wartime.
14. John Adams.
That is not John Adams
and Sedition Acts.
in that picture.
Woodrow Wilson wasn't the only president to suppress dissent against the government. Back in 1798, President John Adams enacted 4 laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts, amid concerns of an imminent war with France.
The Alien Bill made it difficult for people to become U.S. citizens and allowed the president to throw any foreigners he wanted out of the country. The Sedition Bill went even further. It made it a crime for Americans to criticize their government.
These acts targeted immigrants and political dissidents who Adams feared would side with France in the event of war. Among the 4 laws, 3 were Alien Acts, which toughened the citizenship process for immigrants and allowed their deportation if deemed dangerous. The 4th, a Sedition Act, punished anyone spreading false and malicious statements about the government.
They were repressive acts.
And Adams supported this legislation, which then just created this enormous debate within American society about what freedom of press, freedom of speech really meant.
Naturally, these acts faced strong public opposition, sparking protests nationwide. This backlash provided leverage for Adams's opponent, Thomas Jefferson,
who was also his vice president at the time,
who successfully capitalized on it and won the presidential election in 1800.
There's no defending the Alien and Sedition Acts. Just to give some context to it, at the time the country's fairly new. The United States is still a relatively weak power. France had been our biggest ally and one of the main reasons why we were able to win our independence in the first place. But now they've gone through the revolution. Now you're going into the Directory, and eventually you're going to have Napoleon Bonaparte. And there's a risk of, for the young American nation, they're trying to decide who do we ally ourselves with now, because the king we allied with is dead. It's a new government. On the surface, France should be an ally, but by this point, France is undergoing a lot. And so the U.S. has to decide, do we stay neutral? Do we get involved with Europe? Do we make allies? How does this all go down? And John Adams is doing his best to try and keep the country out of a war, while simultaneously trying to build up the country's ability to fight if it does come to war. And it just makes some horrible mistakes in these acts. But remember, Adams didn't do this in a vacuum. He didn't do this by himself. These were laws that were passed by Congress that he signed. So you can blame him, but he's only in a position to be able to sign these acts because Congress passes them. So blame the people in Congress as well, who also thought this was a good idea.
Number 13, Andrew Johnson. Reconstruction and impeachment. Abraham Lincoln's assassination left Andrew Johnson with the task of reintegrating former Confederate states and previously enslaved people into the United States.
Johnson wanted the post-war South treated leniently.
Tommy Lee Jones.
As for the fate of freed slaves, he wanted that left up to the states.
Yeah.
Johnson's Reconstruction policies favored leniency towards the rebels, allowing them to easily rejoin the Union and uphold a system that was essentially still slavery.
And Lincoln also favored a leniency policy, but not in the way that Johnson did.
These policies enraged Congress, which passed laws to counter them, kicking off a bitter struggle with the president. In August 1867, Johnson fired Secretary of War Edward Stanton in violation
Edwin Stanton
of the Tenure of Office Act. The following year, Congress impeached Johnson.
So Congress passes the Tenure of Office Acts. This is one of those instances where a bill is passed not on the merits of the bill, but specifically in order to challenge Andrew Johnson to violate it. They knew, so he inherits, back up. Andrew Johnson's a Democrat. Abraham Lincoln, when he's running in 1864, he wants to run on a national Union ticket. He's looking ahead to the end of the war and trying to think about how best to reunite the country. And what a better way to do that than to put a Southern Democrat who remained loyal to the Union on your ticket. He had been the military governor of Tennessee. Eastern Tennessee, which is where Johnson's from, had been very pro-Union. It made a lot of sense. Unless something happened to Lincoln, which is exactly what happens a month into his second term. So Johnson comes to the presidency and he inherits Lincoln's cabinet, but he's not a Republican. He's not even a moderate Republican like Lincoln. And so the radical Republicans, these are the more extreme wing of the party, of which Lincoln was not a member, but he had been able to kind of hold them together with the more conservative Republicans. They're out for blood. They don't want Johnson to get anything done. And in hindsight, they were probably right about that, because Johnson screws up Reconstruction in the worst way, sets us back a long time in terms of integrating these newly freed slaves. And they really do kind of end up back in a condition of slavery in all but name. But so Lincoln, his cabinet gets inherited by Johnson. People like Edwin Stanton, who had been a Democrat, but by this time is a radical Republican. And they know that Johnson wants to start cleaning out this cabinet and getting his own people in there. And basically Stanton, even though he's technically still the Secretary of War, he's basically kind of suspended from the office, and the General-in-Chief, Ulysses S. Grant, is actually the de facto Secretary of War at this point. And Johnson finally fires him, but before he can fire him, Congress passes this Tenure of Office Act, making it illegal for the president to fire a cabinet member, which is stupid, and it eventually gets repealed. But it was all done to antagonize Johnson and to give them a justification for impeaching him, which is exactly what they did. But the conviction falls one vote short,
making him the first president to face such a resolution.
Finally, the bad blood spilled over. The president was impeached and escaped removal from office by just one vote.
Although he was narrowly acquitted by the Senate, Johnson's presidency was severely weakened, and he failed to win the Democratic nomination in 1868. Number 12, James Buchanan.
His entire presidency. Tough but fair.
James Buchanan's single term as president occurred in the mid-19th century. Since then, many successors have come and gone, yet several historians still consider him the worst president in U.S. history.
He was elected president in 1856, but this Northern Democrats' sympathies with the slave-holding South exacerbated long-simmering tensions.
This is due to his apparent indifference to the impending Civil War. After his inauguration, Buchanan viewed slavery as an issue of little importance. Instead of trying to lessen the rift between the North and the South, Buchanan believed he shouldn't interfere in states' issues.
He feared that if you handled the issue of slavery too robustly, that it would create what he believed would be the end of the Union.
So I think about, there's a quote in the TV show Band of Brothers where you have Carwood Lipton, who's this company first sergeant at the time, and he goes to the acting battalion commander to express his concerns over their company commander. And there's a voiceover where he's talking about this guy, Lieutenant Dyke, and he says, Dyke wasn't a bad leader because he made bad decisions. He was a bad leader because he made no decisions. And that's what I think of when I think of Buchanan. Buchanan didn't make a lot of actively bad decisions. Buchanan just didn't do anything about the bad stuff that was happening. And I've said this before. We have a series of presidents, in particular Franklin Pierce, the 14th president, and then James Buchanan, the 15th, who are seen as among our worst. And I think if they had been elected at any other time in history, we wouldn't necessarily see them as among our worst presidents. But what happened was they were mediocre to bad leaders at a time when the country desperately needed brilliant leadership. And anything short of brilliant leadership was going to fail. And these guys were not up to that challenge. And so it's partially the time in which they're elected, but also their ineffective leadership that leads them to be seen among the worst.
Secession.
He had pledged not to run for a second term, and during the lame duck period between his successor's election and inauguration, southern states began to secede. Buchanan essentially crossed his arms and watched them leave, his incompetence inevitably resulting in the Civil War. Number 11. Warren G. Harding, the Teapot Dome scandal. President Warren G. Harding was in office for only 2 years before his untimely death, but in that little time, he was involved in one of the most shocking political scandals ever.
The Teapot Dome scandal was probably the most significant presidential scandal in American history in the 20th century up until Watergate.
Following his inauguration in 1921, Harding placed his close friends in high-ranking positions, including Albert B. Fall, whom he appointed as Interior Secretary. Harding gave Fall control over 3 naval oil fields, whose drilling rights the Secretary then leased to private oil companies in exchange for bribes. This shady deal was first reported in April 1922, resulting in a Senate investigation.
Congress ordered President Harding to scrap the oil leases. The Supreme Court ruled the leases fraudulent and said Harding's transfer of authority from the Navy to Interior was illegal.
At the time of his death in August 1923, Harding was beloved among the American public. But as the details of this investigation surfaced, his reputation was effectively tarnished.
Yeah, so a couple things about this. Number one, we don't know the full extent to which Harding would have been hurt by that because he dies out west on a trip while he's still president. He's not the only scandal that ends up kind of being part of Harding's life, because later on it's going to come out that he actually fathered a child with a mistress. And they've since proven with DNA that she was indeed his child. But yeah, unlike some presidential scandals where they happen during an administration, but they're not necessarily directly tied to that administration, Grant's a great example of this. Grant had a lot of scandals among people in his cabinet and his administration, but he wasn't directly involved with any of them. He was just naive enough to put people in positions that they took advantage of. And this one, it's pretty clear that Harding not only knew about it, but actively participated in facilitating this stuff. Had he not died in office, what would have happened? Who knows? But his reputation takes a hit, not only because of that, but I think more because of the financial crisis that eventually unfolds later on in the 1920s.
Number 10, Donald Trump, convicted of felony crimes.
This is another one. I mean, this is tough to me because, I mean, I guess it is a U.S. presidential moment because he's running for president this year, but this didn't happen while he was in office.
Trump's election in 2016, 44 individuals had served as president of the United States. Yet in 2024, he made history as the first one to be convicted of a crime.
The stunning verdict was delivered by a Manhattan jury of 7 men and 5 women who deliberated for 2 days, making Mr. Trump the first former American president to be convicted of a crime.
The landmark case stemmed from hush money payments Trump made to adult film star Stormy Daniels to keep their alleged sexual encounter under wraps. The prosecution argued that Trump falsified business records to conceal these payments, a felony under New York law. The trial became a media spectacle and concluded with the jury finding Trump guilty on all 34 counts. This case was one of several criminal charges Trump faced, including his alleged involvement in the January 6th insurrection aimed at overturning the 2020 election, which he lost to Joe Biden.
After this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here we're going to walk down to the Capitol.
Number 9.
So I don't get involved too much in modern politics. I didn't really follow the trial all that much, so I can't speak too much to it anyway. But, I mean, everything they said is true. It is the first time in history that a former U.S. president has been convicted. But I guess the main thing for me is are we just talking about embarrassing moments that happened to people who were president, or are we talking about embarrassing moments that happened during a presidency?
Bill Clinton, the Lewinsky scandal, and impeachment. More than a century after Andrew Johnson's impeachment in 1868, Bill Clinton became the second U.S. president to be impeached by Congress in 1998.
When the dust had cleared, the House, voting almost strictly along party lines, sent 2 articles of impeachment on for trial in the Senate.
Clinton's impeachment was related to an extramarital affair he had with White House intern Monica Lewinsky. Lewinsky confided in her colleague Linda Tripp, who secretly recorded their conversations and handed the tapes to an independent counsel, which was already investigating Clinton on other matters. The ensuing scandal eventually led to his impeachment by the House of Representatives on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice.
So a lot of the scandals that Clinton was dealing with during his presidency actually went back to issues of things that happened before he was president, back when he was governor of Arkansas, Whitewater, things like that. And it was in the course of one of those investigations that he gets asked about Monica Lewinsky, and he does lie under oath about it. And then he tries to, play word games and say, well, it depends on what the meaning of the word is. Now, I will say this about the Clinton thing. This is unfortunately a perfect example of what we're going to see, I think, a lot more moving forward, which is the weaponizing of the powers of impeachment by Congress to go after a president they don't like. And in the grand scheme of things, was it worth impeaching a president because he tried to cover up an affair in an investigation that wasn't about the affair? You can make your own decision about that, but I feel like it did open Pandora's box when it comes to the powers of impeachment being used. And we're going to see a lot more of it, unfortunately, I think.
As he had lied under oath about the affair.
I want the American people to know today that I am still committed to working with people of good faith and goodwill of both parties to do what's best for our country.
Though Clinton was ultimately acquitted by the Senate, the scandal left a lasting stain on his legacy. Number 8, John F. Kennedy, the Bay of Pigs invasion. In early 1960, President Dwight Eisenhower approved a CIA plan to overthrow Cuban leader Fidel Castro. That plan was not executed until the following year, after John F. Kennedy took office.
On April 16th. Did you ever notice how often some of the crap that the U.S. got involved with in the 20th century that went terribly wrong had to do with the CIA?
Kennedy reluctantly agreed to the plan with one major exception.
No air power.
If the operation foundered for the Cuban exiles, the U.S. military would not intervene.
On April 17, 1961, over 1,400 Cuban exiles, who had been trained by the U.S., landed at the Bay of Pigs to launch a full-scale invasion. However, their attempt was dead on arrival. The insurgents on the ground were met with unexpected resistance by Castro's forces and were easily overpowered. especially after Kennedy withheld further air support. Within 3 days, they had all surrendered.
These are 1,400 men. Castro's army is 25,000. The real story here is these desperate men on the beach watching their chances go away, and back in the White House, Kennedy suffering mightily with what to do about this.
This is all just a further extension of what caused the Vietnam War, the Korean War, Afghanistan, a lot of these other conflicts that become kind of proxy wars in the Cold War between communism and capitalism. And this is just one extension of that.
The fiasco became a significant embarrassment for Kennedy, undermining his credibility in the international community and escalating Cold War tensions. Number 7, Herbert Hoover, Mexican repatriation.
Not sure I'd put this in my top 20 most embarrassing presidential moments. We've had some doozies.
Shortly after Herbert Hoover took office in 1929, the U.S. stock market crashed, which sparked the Great Depression. Hoover's strategy to tackle this economic disaster was to blame Mexicans in the U.S., accusing them of taking American jobs. As a result, his administration oversaw the deportation of up to 1.8 million people to Mexico, many of whom were actually U.S. citizens.
Increasingly important is the 60% or more of American citizens of Mexican descent.
That's pretty bad. I mean, that's right up there with interning Japanese Americans during the Second World War. I mean, deporting American citizens to the country they came from.
In other words,
this is another one of those examples, I think, of a situation where you needed extraordinary leadership at a time of serious economic crisis. There's a reason we call it the Great Depression. And you needed a great leader to navigate that, maybe to not necessarily to avoid the Depression. The Depression was probably unavoidable at that point, but to mitigate its impact. And this is an example of someone who's desperate to do something to fix the problem and gets it horribly wrong by focusing on absolutely the wrong thing.
What occurred here was unconstitutional deportation.
100%.
Known as the Mexican repatriation, this scheme was carried out through raids, roundups, and pressure tactics that forced many individuals to leave voluntarily. Unsurprisingly, this did nothing to ease the Great Depression, which ended up contributing to Hubert's defeat in the next election. In 2005, the state of California formally apologized for its role in the repatriation.
The state of California went on to issue a formal apology for its role in the expulsions and built a memorial in downtown Los Angeles to commemorate the victims.
Number 6, Lyndon B Johnson, escalating the Vietnam War. When Lyndon B Johnson became president in 1963 following JFK's assassination, the Vietnam War had already been raging for nearly a decade. At first, American involvement was fairly limited, but this changed dramatically under Johnson. The turning point was the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, where North Vietnamese forces supposedly attacked U.S. Navy ships.
Johnson would use this incident to acquire the power to make war in Vietnam whenever and however he would choose.
Although this attack was later disproven, it led to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave Johnson authority to escalate U.S. military actions in Vietnam. By 1967, there were over 500,000 American troops in Vietnam, many of whom lost their lives.
I guess maybe I'm overanalyzing the word embarrassing. Some of these to me are less about embarrassing situations that make a person look bad personally versus bad policy decisions. But I guess we're kind of doing both here.
Johnson's escalation of the war became highly unpopular in the U.S., sparking nationwide protests and resulting in his decision not to seek re-election.
I don't think anybody disagrees with any of that.
Shall not suit, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Number 5, Ronald Reagan, Iran-Contra affair. In 1986, Ronald Reagan and several of his administration officials became embroiled in a notorious political scandal. They had secretly orchestrated the sale of weapons to Iran, which was under an arms embargo, to secure the release of 7 American hostages. The profits from this sale were then illegally diverted to fund Contra rebels in Nicaragua, who were fighting the leftist Sandinista government.
It's all part of that continued policy of containing enemies, of opposing people, of using proxies in different places. And in this case, it was absolutely 100% illegal, 100% kind of flying under the radar. And while it was kind of a big deal at the time, nothing ever really became of it.
American President Ronald Reagan funnels money to right-wing contra-rebels fighting an insurgency against the Sandinista government.
This was in direct violation of a congressional amendment that banned American aid to the group. When the affair was exposed, it became a major embarrassment for Reagan, raising concerns about his administration's integrity and oversight.
All fair.
Around the same time, Reagan also faced criticism for his delayed response to the AIDS epidemic, which had already been a significant crisis for years.
And this is a great example of a person who, sometimes we have presidents who just make bad decisions all the way around, and something unique and extraordinary happens and they don't deal with it well. Reagan, I think, dealt with some things well, and others, like the AIDS epidemic, I think most people probably would have gotten that wrong. But unfortunately, there's no denying that we didn't tackle that as quickly and as forcefully as we should have. And part of what I think held Reagan back is that he was elected in part because of his conservative policies. And the AIDS epidemic was seen by a lot of people as being a gay thing. And so that might have caused some hesitancy on the part of a conservative president to get involved forcefully in something like this. It was not. Listen, I'm not arguing it was. A lot of people who were not gay, blood transfusions, heterosexual, sexual activity, a lot of different ways that people ended up getting AIDS. And you had a guy like Ryan White, this young kid, who got it from a blood transfusion, who becomes one of the symbols of all this, to say, hey, listen, this is not just something that's happening in these back alley gay bars. This is something that's happening to people of all backgrounds and needs to be dealt with.
At the time, many leaders were accused of ignoring the crisis because it was deemed a gay disease. President Reagan didn't give his first major speech on AIDS until 1987.
Number 4, Franklin Pierce, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Franklin Pierce, a one-term president, is often ranked among the worst and most forgettable leaders in U.S. history. Pierce's administration is largely remembered for passing the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. This act created the territories of Kansas and Nebraska and allowed settlers to decide on the legality of slavery through voting.
Pierce
absolute disaster of a decision in hindsight.
Signed into law the Kansas-Nebraska Act, allowing voters in the Kansas and Nebraska territories to decide whether to allow slavery within their borders.
And they didn't have the ability to foresee what that would result in, which was basically a mini civil war in Kansas.
Negating the earlier Missouri Compromise.
Though it was intended to reduce tensions over slavery, the bill backfired, instead reigniting fierce debates around it. Pro- and anti-slavery settlers rushed to Kansas, hoping to outnumber each other and sway the vote. This led to violent clashes between the two sides, known as Bleeding Kansas. Instead of uniting the country, the Kansas-Nebraska Act only deepened divisions, stoking the fires that culminated in the Civil War.
Classic example of a policy that is meant to do one thing, but actually has the reverse effect and actually does the opposite of what it was intended to do.
He thought making concessions to Southerners was what was necessary to preserve the Union.
Number 3, Richard Nixon, the Watergate scandal and resignation. Few things are as humiliating for a U.S. president as resigning from office. Richard Nixon was the first to experience this due to his involvement in the Watergate scandal.
We have a mystery story out of Washington. 5 people have been arrested and charged with breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in the middle of the night.
Nixon was largely popular during his first term, but to ensure his re-election in 1972, his administration and campaign orchestrated the wiretapping of the Democratic Party headquarters.
And the ironic thing with all of this was it wasn't necessary. Nixon easily won his second term in office.
However, the men sent to do the job were caught red-handed and eventually linked to Nixon's campaign. Desperate to hide his administration's involvement, Nixon tried to obstruct the investigation. This was revealed by his own taped recordings, leading him to resign rather than face impeachment.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Ironically, Nixon had already secured re-election in one of the largest landslides in history, which made the whole fiasco pointless. Number 2,
100%.
Franklin D. Roosevelt.
So I'm trying to think. I mean, is number 1 going to be Ford pardoning Nixon? I mean, I'm trying to think of what else it could be.
Internment of Japanese Americans. Following Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, public opinion in the U.S. slowly began to turn against Japanese Americans. To address fears of further Japanese attacks or sabotage, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066.
Motivated by vocal outcries from politicians and military officials, FDR signed Executive Order 9066, empowering...
This is one of those great examples of somebody giving in to peer pressure, basically, within his own administration, but also within the country at large. And the irony here is that it's Japanese Americans who are going to make up one of the best fighting forces we have in World War II. This regimental combat team that is just ridiculously effective in Europe, that's going to go over there and numerous medals of honor, highly decorated, fight fiercely and well for the country that simultaneously is interning their own relatives because they're of Japanese descent.
The U.S. Army to designate areas from which any or all persons may be excluded.
This order allowed the U.S. government to forcibly remove and relocate people of Japanese descent to internment camps. As a result, about 120,000 Japanese Americans, many of them U.S. citizens, were uprooted from their homes and forced to live under harsh conditions.
Now, the irony here is that in Hawaii, where there are a lot of Japanese Americans and where there were some people of Japanese descent who were working for the Japanese government, they weren't interned, and in part because there was already martial law in Hawaii because of its importance as a Pacific naval base.
Simply due to baseless fears of espionage. Years later, the Ronald Reagan administration officially apologized to the former detainees for this grave injustice and paid $20,000 in reparations to each survivor.
It would take over 40 years before President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, paying reparations to each victim of internment.
Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos.
What is number 1 going to be?
You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into settings and switch on your notifications. Number 1, Andrew Jackson.
Good choice. Good choice.
In the early 1800s, tensions ran high between Native Americans and white settlers over the ownership of indigenous lands in the South, which were ideal for cotton farming.
And before we even get into this one, let's just say that Andrew Jackson is hardly alone in terms of U.S. presidents who get this issue wrong. There's this overarching theme of manifest destiny that just drives Americans to want to settle the West. The reason that the United States gets settled by all these Europeans in the first place is all this land. And it's the ability to make something of yourself by owning your own land and having property and having the rights that come with that you can't get in many countries in Europe. And so as more people pour into the country, more people want to expand and take that land west. So manifest destiny and slavery are the two overarching themes of the 19th century in the U.S., and almost every political decision revolves around those two things. Jackson gets this horribly wrong, but he's not the only one.
The U.S. government signed a treaty that guaranteed that Cherokee land would be off limits to white settlers forever.
Until we won it, and then we'll do it with the Black Hills, and we'll do it with a bunch of other places.
The settlers found a powerful ally in President Andrew Jackson. In 1830, Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, authorizing the forceful displacement of indigenous tribes from their ancestral lands. Between 1830 and 1850, about 60,000 Native Americans were removed from their homes and marched over 1,000 miles to designated Indian territory across the Mississippi River.
Thousands of Native Americans were pulled from their homes in Georgia and other states across the South. Many were shackled in chains and forced to walk at gunpoint more than 1,000 miles west.
And this area right in here, you're talking about eastern Tennessee, western North Carolina, northern Georgia. You're dealing heavily with Cherokee Indians who had very largely westernized, I guess you could say, or Europeanized. They had started dressing like European people of European descent. They had a similar form of government.
Referred to as the Trail of Tears, this journey was brutal and left thousands dead from disease, exposure, and starvation. Today, many scholars view it as an act of genocide and ethnic cleansing against Native Americans. Which of these appalling moments left you shaking your head in disbelief?
All right, so what do you think about the choices that they made there, the ones that they mentioned? Are there things you would add to the list? Are there things you don't think need to be there? I know WatchMojo can sometimes be very surface-y, but I think that one was probably better than most in terms of actually getting into some real history and not just the pop culture stuff. So let me know your thoughts, and if you have suggestions or requests for other things you'd like to see me do a reaction to, let me know in the comment section. Check out the gaming channel, new video going up live later today. Thanks for watching.